The air bit at my exposed skin, a raw, indifferent cold that seemed to claw its way into my bones. Here, at the closed summer camp, caretaker job, alone for winter, the silence was a physical weight, pressing down from the snow-laden pines and up from the frozen earth. It was a silence I had sought, a vast, echoing void meant to mirror the one carved out inside me. My breath plumed, thick and white, obscuring the skeletal branches of the maples for a moment before dissipating into the frigid expanse. Each exhale felt like a tiny part of me escaping, joining the endless, indifferent winter. I traced the perimeter of the main lodge, my boots crunching a steady, rhythmic protest against the packed snow. It was a routine, a dull, repetitive motion designed to keep my hands busy, my mind marginally less occupied with the sharp edges of memory. Peeling paint clung to the clapboards, and a broken swing set, half buried in drifts, stood sentinel near the shore, a rusted monument to laughter long gone. I ran a gloved hand over the rough wood of the porch railing, splinters threatening to catch. Everything here felt abandoned, forgotten, much like I wished I could be. A month. It had only been a month since the world tilted, since the floor dropped out beneath me, since her warmth became a ghost on my skin. I had fled the city, the well-meaning glances of colleagues, the suffocating sympathy that only underscored the unbearable truth. Not when every room there would scream her absence. This camp, this temporary purgatory, was all I could manage. I checked the ancient furnace, its groaning mechanism spitting heat grudgingly. The pipes overhead wept, a slow, metallic drip into a bucket I'd placed there days ago. The sound was a lonely metronome in the vast, empty space. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating rows of stacked plastic chairs, faded banners proclaiming summer of '98, and a collection of dusty board games. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, just me and the ghosts of other people's joy. I moved through the cabins, one by one, a ritual of larking and checking. Each small bunkhouse was identical, 6 beds, a single window, a small chest of drawers. They smelled of stale wood smoke and disinfectant, a clean emptiness. I always locked the doors from the outside, a habit I'd formed to ensure no stray animal or curious wanderer could take refuge. It was also a way to mark my progress, a small victory in the face of so much that felt insurmountable. By the time the last cabin, the furthest one down by the frozen creek, was secured, dusk was already painting the sky in bruised purples and grays. The wind picked up, a low moan through the pines, and snow began to fall again, soft, tentative flakes at first, then a thickening curtain. I pulled my scarf tighter around my face, the coarse wool scratching my skin. It didn't pretend to be anything else. As I turned to head back to the lodge, a glint caught my eye. Near the creek, nestled amongst a cluster of bare alders, was a small red rubber ball. It was a child's toy, worn and faded, but unmistakably a plaything. I paused. I had walked this path every day for a week. I had cleared snow, checked for signs of wildlife, and never seen it. The camp had been meticulously cleaned and packed away before I arrived, every lost sock, every forgotten crayon accounted for. My instructions had been explicit, no lingering remnants of summer. The ball seemed to hum with a quiet energy, a splash of defiant color against the monochrome landscape. I took a step towards it, then another. The snow was fresh, undisturbed, except for my own boot prints. There were no animal tracks around it, no sign of anything that might have dislodged it from a snowdrift. It simply sat there, perfectly still as if placed. My breath hitched. The air felt suddenly heavier, thicker. The low moan of the wind seemed to deepen, to take on a more deliberate cadence, like a breath drawn slowly. I could feel the individual hairs on my arms rise. My fingers, numb inside my gloves, twitched. I stared at the ball, its cheerful red marking the summer landscape. Had it always been there, just hidden beneath the snow until now? Or had something, or someone, left it for me to find? It was a silence I had sought, a balm for the screaming hollow within me. But now, inside the sprawling main lodge of the closed summer camp, caretaker job, alone for winter, it felt less like solace and more like an accusation. The air inside was only marginally warmer than the biting wind, thick with the scent of mildew, decaying wood, and something else, a faint, cloying sweetness, like forgotten potpourri or dried blood. My breath plumed in the dim light of my lantern. The single bulb I'd managed to string up in the entryway cast long, dancing shadows that stretched and shrank with every gust, rattling the old window panes. Dust motes, thick as fine sand, drifted in the anemic beam, catching the light like miniature galaxies. This place, my grandmother's legacy, was a tomb of forgotten time. I began my reluctant tour. The floorboards groaned beneath my boots, each step a protest against my intrusion. The grand hall, once perhaps a vibrant space, now stood hushed and cavernous, echoing my softest movements. A single tattered tapestry depicting a hunting scene hung crookedly from the wall, its threads unraveling like old memories. Rooms branched off the main hall, each one a tableau of neglect. The dining hall still had long, heavy tables, chairs overturned or stacked haphazardly. A thick layer of dust blanketed everything, preserving the last moments of occupancy in a grey film. I picked up a ceramic mug from a shelf, its rim chipped, a faint floral pattern almost entirely obscured. It felt impassably light, like a dried bone. In what I assumed was a recreation room, a billiard table stood draped in a canvas sheet, its felt surface undoubtedly ruined. A stack of ancient board games lay scattered on a low shelf, their boxes swollen with damp. I knelt, brushing away dust, to reveal a faded photograph tucked beneath a loose game board. My grandmother, younger, stood at the back, a stern, unreadable expression on her face, her arm around a small, solemn-looking girl whose gaze seemed to follow me even from the brittle paper. Just old paper, old memories. I tucked the photograph into my jacket pocket. Low hum started then, a faint thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the very floor. I paused, lantern held aloft, straining my ears. The sound intensified, a rhythmic pulse that made the hairs on my arms prickle. It was the generator, I told myself, settling into its rhythm after the long drive. It had to be. But the hum didn't feel mechanical. It felt organic. I moved deeper into the large, pushing open a heavy, unlatched door. This room was different. Smaller, cozier, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A writing desk sat beneath a window, overlooking a patch of snow-covered woods. On the desk, beneath a layer of dust, lay a leather-bound journal. Its pages were brittle, yellowed, filled with elegant looping script. I didn't open it, not yet. The weight of it felt significant, heavy with unspoken words. Suddenly, the lantern flickered, sputtering as if starved for fuel. My breath hitched. I checked the fuel gauge. It was nearly full. A draft, I reasoned, finding its way in through a gap in the window frame. This old place was full of drafts. Faint, almost imperceptible, like dry leaves skittering across a frozen pond. It seemed to coil from the corner of the room, a sibilant breath that grazed my ear. It wasn't words, not really. More like the ghost of a sound, a memory of speech. My scalp tightened. I spun around, my heart knocking against my ribs. Nothing, just the settling dust, the groan of old timbers. I forced myself to breathe, to dismiss it. Grief, isolation, exhaustion, they were playing tricks. My mind was still raw, still picking at the wound of my wife's absence. This old house, with its history, was simply amplifying my own internal discord. I turned back to the room, my gaze sweeping over a small alcove I hadn't noticed before. Tucked away, partially obscured by a moth-eaten curtain, was a wooden chest. The metal gleamed dully under my lantern light, hinting at a recent polishing, or perhaps just a lack of rust. A single, intricate lock made of tarnished brass secured the lid. No keyhole was visible, only a series of strange, interlocking symbols etched into the plate surrounding the lock. I knelt, running my fingers over the cold metal, tracing the unfamiliar glyphs. They felt smooth, worn. My grandmother had kept this. Why? What secrets did it hold, tucked away in this forgotten room, in this isolated lodge at the closed summer camp, caretaker job, alone for winter? And why, after all these years, was it still locked? The silence in the sprawling main lodge of the closed summer camp, caretaker job, alone for winter, was not the gentle quiet I had yearned for. It was a dense, heavy thing, pressing against my eardrums, filling the spaces where my wife's laughter used to echo. The air, thin and sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth, offered little warmth against the biting wind that clawed at the window panes. My breath plumed in the dim light, each exhalation a ghostly cloud in the vast, empty room. I had spent the morning trying to impose order on the chaos of my own mind, raking dead leaves from the camp's neglected pathways, clearing snow from the porch steps, anything to anchor myself to the tangible world. But even the physical exertion couldn't banish the chill that had settled deep in my bones. Late afternoon brought a deeper gloom. I was in the cavernous kitchen, trying to coax life from a stubborn stovetop burner, when I caught it a faint, sweet aroma. Lilacs. A delicate, fleeting note that dissolved into the stale air almost as soon as I registered it. My hands stilled over the burner knob. He had loved them, planted a bush by our bedroom window, their scent drifting in on warm spring nights. A pang, sharp and sudden, pierced through the dull ache of my grief. My throat tightened. It was just a memory, I told myself, a trick of the mind, conjured by the isolation and the sheer weight of what I'd lost. The mind played cruel games when left unchecked, didn't it? I forced myself to breathe, to focus on the sputtering gas. The smell was gone, swallowed by the camp's pervasive dampness, but the ghost of it lingered, a phantom touch on my senses. I ran a hand over my jaw, the stubble rough beneath my fingers. There was this what true isolation felt like, when the boundaries between memory and reality began to blur. A few hours later, as twilight bled across the snow-dusted landscape, painting the world in shades of bruised purple and grey, I heard it. So faint it could have been the wind sighing through a loose shutter, or the house groaning under its own immense age. But it wasn't the wind. It was distinct, a breathy sound, like someone trying to speak just beyond the reach of my hearing. I was in the main hall, attempting to light a fire in the vast stone hearth. The match flickered, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the frigid air. "Hello!" My voice, hoarse and thin, sounded alien in the echoing space. Only the crackle of the kindling, now finally catching, answered me. My shoulders hunched. I listened, straining my pulse a frantic drum against my ribs. Nothing, just the snap and hiss of the fledgling fire. Grief, exhaustion. It had to be. What else could it be? I retreated to the small, cramped office that served as my temporary bedroom, the only room in the large I'd managed to make vaguely habitable. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling cast a harsh, yellow glow. "I all right, mate." The voice of the friend, tinny through the phone, was a lifeline. "Haven't heard from I in a while. How's the caretaker thing?" "It's quiet," I managed, my voice a little too eager. "Very quiet. Listen, I needed to hear a familiar voice. Things here are a bit unsettling." "Unsettling? What's up?" "Bears." The friend chuckled, a sound that felt miles away. "Look, I know it's rough, William, being out there all alone. It's probably just the grief playing tricks. I rest still raw." "No, it's more than that," I insisted, a tremor in my voice. "The house. I keep hearing things, smelling things, things that remind me of her." A pause on the other end. "Listen, mate, I get it, truly. But maybe I need to get out of there for a bit, come back to the city, see someone, talk to someone. Isolating myself, and that's not healthy." His concern was genuine, but his words felt like a dismissal, a diagnosis I couldn't accept. He thought I was breaking. He thought I was losing my mind. Was he right? I need to work through this here," I said, the lie tasting bitter. "I'll call I soon." He didn't understand. How could he? I sat on the edge of the cart, head in my hands. My breath hitched. The air grew heavy, thick, pressing in, and then I saw her. He was standing by the door, framed in the harsh light of the bare bulb. Her eyes, the color of warm honey, looked directly at me. A faint, sad smile played on her lips. It was the voice I'd memorized, the one that had soothed me, excited me, calmed me for years. "You shouldn't be here." My heart seized, a violent clench in my chest that stole my breath. This wasn't a memory. This wasn't a trick of the light. My vision swam, the yellow light of the bulb blurring around the edges. I tried to speak, but only a strangled gasp escaped. My body began to shake, an uncontrollable tremor that started in my knees and rattled through my entire frame. She looked so solid, so utterly there. Then, as quickly as she'd appeared, she began to shimmer, like heat rising from asphalt. Her edges softened, blurred, dissolved. I gasped, a ragged, tearing sound. My stomach heaved, and I stumbled to the small waste bin retching bile. My hands trembled so violently I could barely grip the edge of the cart. My mind reeled. The friend's words echoed, accusing. Grief playing tricks, losing your mind. Was that it? Had the isolation finally broken me? Or was there something else in this accursed place? Something that knew precisely how to twist the knife in my deepest wound? I wiped my mouth, my vision still swimming, the taste of bile bitter on my tongue. The air in the small room felt charged, heavy, as if something vast had just passed through it. I stared at the empty doorway, my eyes wide, pupils dilated. Had I truly seen her? Or had the last vestiges of my sanity finally crumbled, leaving me adrift in a sea of manufactured horrors? On what I couldn't say, my throat had constricted, a dry, suffocating knot. Her eyes, those familiar, deep pools I had loved, held no recognition, only a vacant, chilling stillness. Her lips, pale and unmoving, seemed to stretch, though no sound escaped them. A phantom chill, colder than the winter air outside, pressed against my skin. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. The yellow light of the bulb seemed to flicker, catching nothing but dust motes dancing in the sudden emptiness. My knees buckled. I stumbled back against the wall, my head hitting the plaster with a dull thud. The pain was a welcome anchor, a sign that some part of this reality still held. I slid down, collapsing onto the cold floorboards, my chest heaving. Was I losing my mind? Had the grief finally broken me? The thought was a familiar, unwelcome guest, always lurking at the edges of my sanity since her passing. I stayed there for a long time, curled on the floor, listening to the house creak around me. The wind howled outside, a mournful lament that seemed to echo my own internal turmoil. I needed to do something, anything, to ground myself. My caretaker duties for the closed summer camp, caretaker job, alone for winter called, a mundane anchor in a sea of encroaching madness. I was supposed to be checking the old lodge's water pipes, ensuring they hadn't frozen solid in the bitter snap. Pushing myself up, my muscles screamed in protest. My legs felt like lead, my hands trembled. I gripped the banister, forcing myself to descend the main staircase, each step a conscious effort. I bypassed the main lodge, heading instead for my grandmother's study, a room I'd been avoiding. It was filled with her things, a mausoleum of memories I wasn't ready to confront. But I needed a distraction, a task that demanded focus, not just mindless wandering. I told myself I'd start sorting her books, a simple, logical task. The study air was thick with the scent of aged paper and dust, a faint, sweet decay clinging to everything. Stacks of yellowed ledgers and brittle maps from the camp were piled on a heavy oak desk. I ran my hand over the cool, polished surface, seeking a semblance of order. As I did, my fingers brushed against a loose section of the desk's side paneling. Curiosity, a fragile thing in my current state, pricked at me. I pressed harder, and with a soft click, a small, narrow section of the panel slid inward, revealing a cavity. My breath hitched. My heart, already a frantic drum, now hammered against my ribs with renewed vigor. It was old, its cover worn smooth, the edges frayed. A single tarnished brass clasp held it shut. My hands shook as I reached for it, the leather cool and dry against my fingertips. It felt heavier than it looked, imbued with a silent weight. I pulled it out, setting it gently on the desk. Dust motes, disturbed by its removal, danced in the weak lamplight. With trembling fingers, I unlatched the clasp. The pages inside were thin, brittle, filled with elegant, looping script in faded ink. It was my grandmother's handwriting. I recognized it from the occasional holiday cards she'd sent years ago, before she became a ghost to me. The first few entries were mundane, observations about the camp, the changing seasons. But then, the tone shifted. October 12th. The quiet here has changed. It's no longer peaceful, faint at first like the wind through the eaves, but they settle, they burrow. I swallowed, a dry rasp in my throat. The word echoed in my mind, an icy finger tracing down my spine. November 3rd. They call to me, not with words, not really. More like a resonance, a vibration in the marrow of my bones. They know things, they promise things. I must be strong. I must resist. The pact, it binds us. But I fear it binds us to something terrible. My vision blurred. The word was a heavy stone in my gut. What pact? With whom? My grandmother, a woman I had always imagined as fiercely independent, almost untouchable, had written these words in fear. They twist, They writhe. They tell me he is waiting. My darling girl, they promise her return. But I know the price. The price is everything. It is always everything. And then more. My breath caught. Was she speaking of my mother? My stomach churned, a sickening lurch. December 24th. Asterisk, the hunger grows, not mine, theirs. I see it in the eyes of the other caretaker. Awaiting, it won't be long. The cycle turns. Another host, another echo. Another caretaker. I was the only one here alone, responsible for the closed summer camp, caretaker job, alone for winter. This wasn't just a haunted house. This wasn't just my grief playing tricks. A cycle. A host. The implications were a suffocating weight. I flipped frantically through the remaining pages. Most were blank or filled with frantic, illegible scribbles. But one last entry near the back stood out, scrawled in a hand that seemed barely able to hold the pen. January 10th. He will come, my grandson. He will inherit more than the house. He will inherit the burden. Tell him the pact is real. Tell him to fight. But can anyone truly fight the chorale of echoes? My own name wasn't written, but the message was undeniably for me. The chorale of echoes. My hands trembled so violently, I almost dropped the journal. The casual way it mentioned me, my inheritance, the burden. It wasn't a warning from the grave. It was a desperate plea from a woman who had faced something unspeakable. I looked up from the journal, my gaze sweeping around the dimly lit study. Had I heard them too? There was that what I dismissed as the wind, as my own fractured thoughts. This wasn't about a ghost in the halls. This was about family, my family. And whatever the pact truly was, it felt like it was already closing around me. What had my grandmother truly left behind? The words from the journal still burned behind my eyes, a cold brand on my consciousness. The chorale of echoes. My inheritance, my burden. I stood in the grand hall of the manor, the musty air suddenly feeling thin, suffocating. The silence was no longer merely quiet. It hummed with an unseen presence, a low thrumming that resonated in my bones. I clenched my jaw, trying to shake off the lingering chill, the insidious suggestion that I was not alone. I needed to clear my head. The journal had been too much, too direct. I began to walk, my footsteps echoing on the polished floorboards, a lonely drumbeat in the vast, empty space. I passed the towering grandfather clock, its pendulum unmoving, frozen in some forgotten moment. I remember thinking how strange it was that the air in this specific spot felt different, sharper, carrying a faint tang of pine and damp earth, so unlike the usual scent of old paper and dust that clung to the manor. I paused, inhaling deeply, searching for the source. Nothing, just the faint, familiar scent of decay. My mind was playing tricks, I decided, still reeling from the unsettling revelation. I moved towards the great bay window that overlooked the overgrown gardens. The glass was streaked with grime, blurring the skeletal branches of the ancient oaks, but I still craved the sight of the outside world, an anchor to reality. As I approached, the familiar pattern of the wallpaper faded damask. A tapestry of forgotten roses seemed to shimmer at the edges of my vision. A trick of the light, perhaps, or my tired eyes. I blinked, rubbing at them, and when I looked again, the roses were gone. In their place, rough-hewn logs stretched upwards, meeting at a low, sloped ceiling. My breath hitched. I looked down. My shoes rested not on elegant wood, but on bare, uneven planks. A thick layer of frost coated the single-pane window before me, obscuring the view. The grand hall, the towering ceilings, the echoing space, all gone. I was in a small, cramped cabin. The air was frigid, biting at my exposed skin, and carried the unmistakable smell of stale wood smoke and mildew. Pine needles crunched under my boots as I shuffled forward, disoriented, my mind struggling to reconcile what I saw with what I knew. This wasn't the manor. This was. A raw, bitter wind rattled the flimsy window frame, whistling through unseen cracks. Outside, through the icy film, I could just make out the skeletal forms of bare trees, their branches clawing at a bleak, grey sky. Beyond them, a vast expanse of frozen white stretched into the distance, reflecting the dull light like a sheet of tarnished silver. My eyes darted around the sparse room. A cart in one corner, a rusty wood-burning stove in another, a single, scarred wooden table in the center. I pushed my hand against the nearest wall, the rough timber digging into my palm. It was solid, real. I spun around, my heart racing, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. There was no one. The cabin was empty, save for me. It had sounded like a "No," I choked out, my voice thin and reedy in the overwhelming stillness. "No, this isn't real." I pressed my hands to my temples, trying to force the image of the manor back into my mind to dispel this impossible illusion. I closed my eyes, counting to 10, then opened them again. The cabin remained, the frost on the window. I was here. I was at a closed summer camp caretaker job, alone for winter. The thought materialized, fully formed in my head, as if it had always been there, a forgotten truth now surfacing. But it couldn't be. I had been at the manor. I was at the manor. My grip on reality felt like a fraying thread. A soft scratching sound came from the far corner of the cabin, near the wood stove. A rhythmic, deliberate scrape, like fingernails dragging across rough metal. I edged away, my gaze fixed on the spot. My breath hitched in my throat. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, accompanied by a low, guttural murmur that resonated deep in my chest. Slowly, agonizingly, it pulled itself into existence, stretching and twisting like a reflection in rippling water. It was tall, impassably slender, draped in something that looked like a tattered wedding dress, but the fabric was stained, mud-caked and torn. A veil, heavy with dirt, obscured its face, but I knew. I felt it in my very soul. It took another step and another, until it was fully in the dim light of the cabin. The veil lifted, not by a hand, but as if by an unseen wind, revealing a face I knew better than my own. Her eyes, those beautiful, intelligent eyes, were sunken and black, like bottomless pits. Her skin was a sickly gray, stretched taut over sharp cheekbones. A single, jagged tear ran from her temple down to her chin, as if her face had been crudely sewn together. Her lips, once soft and full, were drawn back in a rictus grin that exposed teeth too long, too sharp, too numerous. "You left me," it rasped, the voice a grotesque parody of her gentle tones, laced with a sound like splintering bone. "You promised. You always promised." It lunged, not with speed, but with a horrifying, deliberate slowness that made my blood freeze. Its emaciated hands, tipped with long, yellowed claws, reached for me. I could smell it then, the cloying sweetness of decay, mixed with something metallic and utterly foul. I stumbled backwards, tripping over my own feet, scrambling to get away from the impassable horror. This wasn't Sarah. This was a perversion, a mockery, a malicious echo designed to tear me apart. I hit the wall with a sickening thud, the rough logs scraping against my back. The creature was upon me, its face inches from mine, those black eyes burning into my soul. I could feel the sharp points of its claws just brushing my chest, the tattered lace of its dress brushing my arm. The words it spoke were a flood of accusations, twisting every memory, every promise, every loving gesture into something venomous and cruel. It knew. It knew every hidden corner of my grief, every fragile hope I still clung to. I squeezed my eyes shut, a desperate plea for it to disappear, to be just a nightmare. When I opened my eyes again, it was gone. The cabin was empty, silent, save for the frantic drumming of my own heart, but the air still reeked of its presence, and the faint, sickly, sweet scent of decay clung to my clothes. My chest burned where its claws had almost touched me, a phantom pain that felt horribly real. I slid down the wall, collapsing onto the frozen floorboards, gasping for air. This wasn't some trick of the light, some figment of an overwrought imagination. This was real. It had come for me. But how had it found me here in this desolate, frozen place that wasn't even real? My breath still hitched. A ragged thing caught in my throat. The scent of decay, that metallic, cloying sweetness, lingered in my nostrils even after I stumbled back, catching myself against the grand, cold banister. It hadn't touched me. Not quite. The long, yellowed claws had scraped the air where I'd been a heartbeat before, leaving behind a chill that burrowed deep into my bones. I scrambled up the stairs, not daring to look back, my legs burning with a desperate, animal need to escape. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, each beat a painful reminder of how close it had been. The room offered no solace. Every antique book, every framed portrait of a stern-faced ancestor seemed to watch me, their eyes holding a silent accusation. I needed answers. Not just a fleeting glimpse of a spectral horror, but understanding. I needed to know what this thing was and why it was here, in my house. The decision was a frantic, desperate surge of adrenaline. I pulled open drawers, scattering papers, my fingers brushing against brittle, yellow documents. My grandmother had kept everything. Ledgers, letters, diaries, all crammed into dusty boxes and overflowing shelves. The air grew thick with the smell of old paper and mildew, a scent that usually comforted me but now felt suffocating. I started with the most obvious, family records. My eyes scanned names, dates, annotations in elegant looping script. It was like sifting through sand, looking for a grain of gold. Hours blurred. The faint light of dawn struggled to pierce the heavy curtains, painting the room in sickly grays. My eyes burned, my head a dull throb. I found it first in a series of letters from a great-aunt, written in the late 1800. Her correspondence grew increasingly erratic. Initial letters were filled with mundane details of manor life. Then a subtle shift. "My nerves are quite frayed," she wrote. "Such unsettling quiet. The woods seem to listen." Later, "I believe I am forgetting things, small details, faces. My own reflection seems unfamiliar." The final letter, dated just weeks before her documented disappearance, simply read, it calls, disappearance. Not death, not illness, just gone. I found similar hints in other documents. Another, a great-uncle, described in a newspaper clipping as having succumbed to a sudden, inexplicable madness, found wandering the local woods, babbling about the music of memory before he vanished. What had happened to them? My search led me to a collection of local historical society pamphlets, surprisingly kept within the manor's own library. One detailed the history of the surrounding area, including an old summer camp nestled deep in the woods, just a few miles from the manor. I remembered passing signs for it on the way here, faded and overgrown. The pamphlet mentioned an incident in the winter of 1957 where a caretaker, working a caretaker job, alone for winter, at the closed summer camp, vanished without a trace. The local sheriff's report cited unfavorable weather conditions and possible animal attack, but the language felt too dismissive, too quick to explain away. The caretaker's name was Elias Vance. A marginal note, scribbled in my grandmother's familiar hand, simply stated, "He heard the songs." The songs. That phrase echoed in my head. I pushed aside the historical pamphlets, my hands reaching for a section of the library I had previously ignored, hidden behind a sliding panel disguised as a bookshelf. My grandmother had a peculiar taste in literature. Books bound in unmarked leather, titles in archaic script, symbols I didn't recognize. My breath hitched again. I pulled out a heavy tome, its pages brittle, filled with crude woodcut illustrations. The text was dense, convoluted, speaking of ancient pacts and sacrifices. My eyes darted across the pages, searching, desperate. Then I saw it. It twisted reality, making the familiar strange, and preyed on grief, using it as a doorway. It was not bound by stone or mortar, but by the land itself, particularly where the veil thins where sorrow dwells. The woods, the manor, even the old summer camp. It made sense. My fingers traced the faded script, my mind reeling. It was all connected. This wasn't just a haunting. It was a predator, an entity with a name, a method, a history tied to my family. It wasn't just a ghost. It was something worse. My grandmother hadn't just died. He had been part of this. And now I was its next designated host. The book didn't say how to fight it. It only spoke of its hunger, its ancient reach. What did it mean, designated host? I pulled the unmarked leather books from the hidden shelf, their spines rough and unyielding beneath my fingertips. They felt ancient, carrying a silent weight. One fell open, revealing brittle, yellowed pages filled with cramped, spidery script. Not English, not any language I recognized, but the illustrations. Crude, disturbing sketches of figures with elongated limbs, twisted faces, and symbols that made my stomach clench. A shiver traced its way down my spine, cold and insistent, even in the library's stagnant air. Then the air shifted, then tore. It wasn't a draft, but a sudden, violent vacuum that sucked the very breath from my lungs. The rich, musty scent of ancient paper and dust vanished, replaced by something sharp, metallic, and cold. The ornate wallpaper of the library seemed to ripple, the floral patterns blurring into something indistinct, like ink dissolving in water, then peeling away in silent, invisible strips. The floorboards beneath my feet groaned, not with the familiar sound of aged wood settling, but with a deep, guttural moan that vibrated up through my soles, rattling my teeth. I stumbled, my arms flailing, but there was nothing to grasp. The walls dissolved completely, or perhaps they never existed. The air turned frigid, biting, carrying the unmistakable tang of pine resin and damp earth. My eyes darted around, frantic. One moment, I was suffocating in the stagnant warmth of the library, staring at indecipherable script. The next, I was standing on packed earth, surrounded by the skeletal silhouettes of pine trees that clawed at a sky the color of bruised plums, heavy and lightless. My breath hitched, a ragged gasp that turned to vapor in the biting air. The silence was absolute, broken only by the frantic thrumming in my ears, a high-pitched whine that threatened to shatter my skull. Where was the manor? Where were the walls, the ceiling, the familiar scent of old wood and dust? I was at a closed summer camp, caretaker job, alone for winter. But I couldn't remember how I got here, or when I got here. Had I been here for days, weeks? The thought was a splinter under my skin, digging deeper with every unanswered question. The camp stretched before me, a collection of dilapidated wooden cabins huddled together like hunched beasts against the encroaching forest, paint peeled from their walls in long, ragged strips, curling like dead skin. I tried to move to retrace my steps, but the ground felt uneven, treacherous. I remembered a pot-bellied stove, a stack of split logs, the radiating warmth of a fire. Had I left it burning, or had I never even lit it? My mind felt like a broken clock, gears spinning wildly without purpose, unable to connect past to present. I walked towards what looked like the main lodge, a larger cabin with a sagging porch that leaned precariously. The door, when I reached it, was not just locked, but warped, swollen with damp, refusing to yield even an inch. I pounded on it, a desperate rhythm against the thick wood, the impact jarring my shoulder, but the sound was swallowed by the vast, empty expanse. No echo, no response. Only the deepening hum, now a low thrumming that seemed to vibrate inside my skull, making my teeth ache. This was the same hum I had heard before, the one that accompanied the songs, the one that promised the unraveling of everything. I turned, intending to try another cabin, but the path I had just taken was gone. In its place stood a thicket of thorny bushes, their branches woven together into an impenetrable, barbed wall. Panic clawed at my throat, a dry, choking sensation. I looked back at the lodge, then to the side. The cabins that had been neatly arranged moments ago now seemed to have shifted, like chess pieces rearranged by an unseen hand. The one I had just tried to enter now stood at an impassable angle to the others, its front door facing directly into the dense woods, away from any discernible path. The very landscape was marking me, twisting itself into new, impassable configurations. My head throbbed, a relentless drumbeat in time with the internal hum. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to clear the fog, to remember the library, the comforting weight of the books, the reality I knew. When I opened them, the camp was still there, but subtly different. The silence was heavier, pressing against my eardrums until they ached. My stomach churned with a growing nausea. I stumbled forward, blindly pushing through the undergrowth, ignoring the thorns that snagged at my clothes and pricked my skin. I was determined to find a way out, to find the edge of this illusion. Or was it an illusion? My memory felt like a sieve, leaking details, dates, the very sequence of events. Was I really William? Was I really a caretaker? Or was this entire existence a fabrication, spun from the threads of my deepest isolation? A cruel joke played by an entity I couldn't even name. A glint of tarnished metal caught my eye, half buried near the base of a gnarled pine. I knelt, scraping away the frozen earth with numb fingers. It was a child's toy, a small, tin soldier, its painted face faded into an indistinct blur, its rifle bent at an unnatural angle. I picked it up. This wasn't just a random camp. This felt personal, a specific memory, a summer, laughter, and then nothing, just a gaping hole where the rest of the recollection should have been. I stood, clutching the soldier, its sharp edges digging into my palm. My breath misted in the freezing, my chest tight. The hum intensified, a low thrumming that vibrated inside my skull, making my teeth ache, not English. But the ink, a faded sepia, seemed to shimmer in the low light of the desk lamp, almost alive. My breath hitched. A small, crudely drawn illustration on the facing page caught my eye. It was a stylized rendering of a human figure, its head thrown back, mouth agape, surrounded by swirling, indistinct forms that looked like smoke or sound waves. Below it, a series of symbols repeated, a pattern emerging. I traced them with a finger that felt suddenly clumsy. My grandmother's study, usually a place of quiet, scholarly dust, now felt like a vault cracking open. I was alone, deep in the closed summer camp, caretaker job, alone for winter, the silence outside the manor thick and suffocating. No one would hear me, no one would interrupt. I had no key to this script, no Rosetta Stone. Yet, as my gaze lingered on the swirling forms, on the open mouth of the drawing, a peculiar sensation began to bloom in my chest. It wasn't understanding, not yet, but a strange resonance. The shapes on the page seemed to vibrate, and then, impassibly, the symbols themselves began to shift, to rearrange, not on the page, but in my mind. A word, half-formed, appeared in my thoughts, then another. It was like listening to a garbled radio signal slowly resolve into speech. The first fragments were disjointed, horrifying. The family, the bloodline, a bond, not of this earth. My head throbbed. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, but the words, once glimpsed, refused to recede. They were there beneath the foreign script, like a palimpsest etched directly onto my perception. I turned the page, compelled by a force beyond curiosity. More illustrations, constellations not found in any observatory, geometries that twisted the eye, and always the swirling forms, the open mouth, and the words now flowing faster, clearer, but no less terrifying. Generations passed. The famine, the plague, a bargain struck. A bargain. The chill that had been creeping up my spine now settled deep in my bones. This wasn't some natural haunting. This was something ancient, deliberate. The text spoke of ancestors, desperate and starving, facing a horror of their own, a blight that threatened to wipe their lineage from the earth. They had sought a solution, a salvation, and they had found it, or so they believed, in the chorale of echoes. Power granted, fortune restored, the price concealed. The language grew less arcane in my mind, the meaning brutally direct. The family had traded their future for a reprieve, for prosperity, for an escape from a different, perhaps even greater, horror. But the pact had teeth. It demanded a tithe, a payment. Not gold, not livestock. Something far more intimate. The inheritor, the chosen conduit, every few generations to anchor the song. My breath hitched again, catching in my throat. My vision blurred, not from tears, but from the sudden, overwhelming pressure behind my eyes. Anchor the song. What did that mean? To be a vessel, a gateway, a living sacrifice. The words burned into my mind, not just read, but felt. The book described the process, though vaguely, implying a merging, a slow dissolution of self, a transformation into something that was no longer quite human, but a bridge for the chorale of echoes to touch this dimension. Something else, something utterly alien. Then a name scrawled in the margin, almost an afterthought, but it stood out like a brand. William, my name. My hands began to tremble violently, the old leather books threatening to slip from my grasp. It wasn't just a family secret. It was my secret. It was my inheritance. They were the entity's song, its prelude, calling to its next designated host. To me, the room, once merely quiet, now felt charged, heavy. I could hear a faint, high-pitched whine, like wind through a distant, broken pipe, though there was no wind inside. The air grew thick, metallic, tasting of damp earth and something acrid, like burnt sugar. My stomach churned. I felt an urgent need to vomit, to expel whatever foul truth had just taken root inside me. I wasn't just a victim, stumbling into a forgotten horror. I was the centerpiece, the chosen one, the next anchor. The final page I read, or rather perceived, spoke of the host's ultimate fate. Not death, not entirely, something far worse. A complete subsumption, a conscious awareness trapped within a shell that was no longer its own, broadcasting the entity's presence into the world. A living echo. They had brought me here. I slammed the book shut, the sound echoing too loudly in the heavy air. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against a coming storm. My gaze darted around the study, seeing the familiar objects now through a new, terrifying lens. The antique clock, the dusty globe, the faded tapestry, were they watching me? Were they already part of the chorus? What did a host do once fully anchored? And how long did I have before the song became my own? The words from the book clawed at my mind, each one a fresh splinter under the skin. Anchor the song, a vessel, a gateway, a living sacrifice. My grandmother's legacy then, not land or wealth, but a sentence. My wife's memory, twisted into a lure, my grief a key. I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes, trying to rub away the burning pressure, but the phantom weight of the book's truths remained. There was no solace in understanding, only a sharper terror. I had to get out. The thought was a raw, urgent pulse, overriding the chill that had settled deep in my bones. The air itself felt thick, vibrating with an unheard hum. I moved with a desperate urgency, shoving the heavy book back onto its shelf, or at least, a shelf that felt right. My hands trembled too much to care for precision. I grabbed my old, worn canvas bag from the hallway, stuffing in a few stale biscuits I'd found in the pantry, a bottle of lukewarm water, and the thick wool blanket I'd been using on the sofa. Survival instincts, crude and unrefined, took over. The manor groaned around me, a symphony of settling timbers and shifting plaster. The floorboards sang beneath my weight, a discordant chorus. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The heavy oak front door, usually a stubborn beast, seemed to yield with surprising ease, swinging inward on groaning hinges. A blast of frigid air hit me, sharp and clean, cutting through the stagnant, heavy atmosphere of the house. For a moment, hope, thin and fragile as ice, flickered. I was out. The world outside was a muted tapestry of grey and white. A light, ceaseless drizzle had turned the overgrown lawn into a slick, treacherous expanse. The bare branches of ancient oaks clawed at the bruised sky. My breath plumed in front of me, visible and fleeting. I struck out across the muddy ground, my boots sinking with each step, the squelch a rhythm to my panicked flight. I pushed deeper into the woods, hoping to skirt the manor's immediate perimeter to find a clearer way out. The trees here were denser, their skeletal forms interlocking overhead, creating a canopy that swallowed the already weak light. The ground grew uneven, strewn with slick, decaying leaves and unseen roots that snagged at my feet. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but the fear driving me was a far more potent fuel. Then, the trees thinned abruptly. I stumbled out of the dense woods, not under the familiar dirt track, but into a wide, desolate clearing. Before me stretched a landscape of stark, skeletal structures. Empty cabins, their windows boarded over, lined a wide, central path. A large, dilapidated mess hall stood silent, its porch sagging. A flagpole, bare of any banner, pointed a stark finger at the sky. This wasn't the road. This was a closed summer camp, caretaker job, alone for winter. My mind reeled. How had I gotten here? I hadn't seen any signs, no turnoffs. One moment I was in the manor's woods, the next this. A broken swing set groaned in the wind, its chains creaking a desolate tune. I was still alone, yes, but the isolation felt different here, more profound, more crushing. This wasn't an escape. It felt like another trap. The stillness of the camp was unnerving, too absolute. No birdsong, no rustle of unseen animals. Only the wind, whistling through the gaps in the cabin boards, sounding like 1,000 thin voices sighing my name. It was as if the entity had simply peeled back the veneer of my reality, revealing a deeper layer of its dominion. I tried to move, to run, but my legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot. The air around me grew dense, pressing in. I heard it then, a low, resonant thrumming that vibrated in my teeth, in my very bones. It wasn't a sound from outside. It was inside me, a sympathetic vibration. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble, subtly at first, then with increasing intensity. A sudden, violent gust of wind ripped through the clearing, not from any discernible direction, but from everywhere at once. It howled, a hungry, wordless shriek. Loose planks tore from the mess hall, slamming against the ground. The swing set shrieked as if in agony. But it wasn't just the wind. Something struck me. Not a branch, not a piece of wood, but something formless and immense. It hit me in the chest, a blow that emptied my lungs and sent me sprawling onto the icy mud. The impact knocked the breath from me, leaving me gasping, struggling to draw air into my burning chest. My head hit the frozen earth with a sickening thud, and for a moment the world spun into a kaleidoscope of grey and black. I tried to push myself up, but my limbs felt like lead. A pressure, invisible yet palpable, clamped onto my ankle. Then a sharp, searing pain shot up my leg. I cried out, a raw, strangled sound. I was being dragged. Not gently, not slowly, but with brutal, relentless force. The ground scraped against my back, tearing at my coat, biting into my skin. The mud smeared my face. I clawed at the frozen earth, my fingers scrabbling for purchase, but there was nothing to hold onto. The thrumming grew louder, a deafening roar in my skull. I was being pulled back, irresistibly, into its embrace. What waited for me inside now that my escape had failed so spectacularly? I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes until pinpricks of light burst behind the lids. The words from the journal, scrawled in my grandmother's spidery hand, still burned against my inner vision. Anchor the song, a vessel, a gateway, a living sacrifice. My wife's memory, twisted into a lure. My grief, a key. The revelation had carved a hollow space in my chest, colder than the winter air seeping through the old manor's warped window frames. I was the caretaker now, alone for winter, at what had once been my grandmother's estate, now functioning as a closed summer camp. Snow had drifted against the porch steps, burying the faded welcome mat. The distant cabins, skeletal outlines against the grey sky, stood silent sentinels to my isolation. Each gust of wind rattling the glass felt like a personal intrusion, a cold breath against my neck. My breath plumed in the frigid air of the study, a fragile cloud that dissipated too quickly, like everything else. The house itself felt like a living thing, its timbers groaning, its pipes clanking. It hummed just beneath the threshold of hearing, a discordant symphony of fading thoughts, a chorus of swallowed identities. "Come closer, William. Let us in." My name, spoken in a voice so achingly familiar, so perfectly hers, made my stomach lurch. It was a cruel mimicry, a trap laid with the bait of my deepest longing. I hadn't slept in days. My hands trembled, a constant, low vibration that made the spoon clatter against the mug when I tried to drink the lukewarm tea. Food turned to ash in my mouth. I kept tasting dust, metallic and dry, no matter what I ate. The entity wanted my mind. It wanted to consume my consciousness, to add my thoughts, my memories, my very self to its cacophony. That was the clarity that pierced through the haze of my exhaustion and fear. It wasn't just a haunting, it was a hungry presence, a parasite that fed on the living mind, leaving behind an echo. My grief, raw and open, was the perfect entry point. It was a breach in my defenses, a welcoming gate for the monstrous thing to slip through and anchor itself, using my reality as its own. I stared at the journal again, the heavy leather cover cool beneath my fingertips. My grandmother, for all her madness, had left me fragments of a defense. Not a cure, not an escape, but a desperate, dangerous countermeasure. Then a new section. A different ink, a firmer hand, perhaps even my grandmother's brief moments of lucidity or another ancestor's warning. To sever the tether, the vessel must be rendered unsuitable. The grief, the anchor, it must be offered not to appease but to confound. A mirror, not of glass but of memory. A cage forged from pain. It clicked into place. The entity sought to become my grief, to use my wife's memory as its ultimate anchor. But if I could twist that connection, if I could offer that grief in a way that corrupted its purpose, perhaps I could sever its hold. The journal spoke of a specific object, the memory locket, of tarnished silver, etched with the forgotten sorrow of 1,000 nights. It hung by the lake, in the smallest cabin, for generations. The lake, the cabins, the closed summer camp, caretaker job, alone for winter environment, suddenly transformed from a desolate refuge into a battleground. The smallest cabin by the frozen lake, I knew the one. It was barely more than a shed, used for storing canoes in the summer, boarded up tight for the winter. It was remote, isolated even from the main manor. Perfect for a ritual no one should ever witness. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. It was a dangerous, terrible plan. To deliberately offer my most profound sorrow, the memory of her touch, her laugh, her final, fading breath to such a thing. It would be twisted, corrupted, devoured. But if it meant breaking its hold, if it meant saving what little was left of me, I pushed away from the desk, the old chair scraping loudly on the floorboards. My resolve, fragile as it was, hardened. I needed to prepare. I needed to find that locket. And then I needed to perform this horrific ritual. You will be ours, William, all of you, soon. I grabbed the thickest coat from the hall closet, its wool smelling faintly of mothballs and damp. I filled it with kerosene, the smell sharp and acrid. Matches, a knife. Not for protection, but for, I didn't know yet. The journal was vague about the exact offering. My eyes scanned the manor's dim interior, the peeling wallpaper, the dust motes dancing in the weak light filtering through the grimy windows. Every creak, every groan of the old house now held a sinister significance. It was no longer just a house. It was a cage, and I was its captive. I had to break free. The wind howled outside, a mournful cry that seemed to pierce the very walls. The camp grounds would be treacherous, buried under drifts of snow, the path to the lake obscured. But I had to go. I had to find that locket. The air outside was a bitter, damp claw, raking at my exposed skin. I pulled the heavy wool coat tighter, its scent of mothballs a strange comfort against the creeping chill. My grandmother's lantern, a cold weight in my hand, cast a wavering circle of sickly yellow light onto the gravel path. Matches rattled in my pocket, tiny promises of warmth. The knife, tucked into my belt, felt like a cold stone. Not for defense, not really for something else, something I had to do. The path twisted into the skeletal embrace of the woods, the trees like gnarled, reaching fingers. I felt a pressure against my temples, a faint hum that vibrated in my teeth. It was the house, still looming behind me, its influence seeping into the very ground. I pushed through the dense undergrowth, the frozen earth cracking underfoot. The scent of pine needles, wet soil, and something else, something metallic and faint, like old blood, filled my nostrils. The way seemed longer than it should have been, the familiar landmarks of the estate grounds appearing warped out of place. A stone bench I remembered near the pond was now half buried in a tangle of thorny vines, its surface slick with frost. Had it always been so close to the path, or had the path itself shifted? I shook my head, trying to clear the fog, but it clung to my thoughts, insistent. Finally, the trees thinned, revealing a wide, desolate clearing. Before me stood the collection of weathered wooden structures. The closed summer camp, caretaker job, alone for winter. It was just as I remembered, only more forlorn, more utterly abandoned. The main lodge, a long, low building with a sagging roof and boarded-up windows, loomed largest. Smaller cabins clustered around it, their porches collapsing, their paint peeling like sunburnt skin. No wind, no rustle. Just the faint, persistent hum in my skull. I walked towards the lodge, my boots crunching on frozen gravel. The door was heavy, swollen with damp, but it opened with a groan that echoed through the empty space. Inside, the recreation hall was a cavern of frigid air and dust motes dancing in the meager light from my lantern. Bare wooden floorboards stretched into gloom. A cold stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth filled with dead ashes. The scent of stale wood smoke and something else, something cloying and ancient, hung heavy. This was it. From my coat pocket, I pulled out the small leather-bound book I'd found hidden in the manor's deepest cellar. Its pages, brittle and yellowed, spoke of a severance, a severing of ties, a breaking of the pact. It was a counter-ritual, a desperate gamble. My hands trembled as I opened the book to the marked page. The symbols were crude, unsettling. I knew what I had to do. I laid the knife flat on the dusty table, its blade reflecting the lantern's weak glow. Then, with a deep breath, I began to chant the words, low and guttural, feeling them vibrate in my chest. They were not words I understood, not truly, but they felt ancient, potent. As the first syllable left my lips, the hum in my head intensified, becoming a piercing whine. The air in the hall grew heavy, thick, like breathing water. The dust motes in the lantern light began to swirl, not gently, but violently, like a miniature maelstrom. Then the sounds began. A scraping, dry sound, like fingernails dragging across stone, coming from everywhere and nowhere. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate inside my bones. I saw movement, fleeting glimpses of forms that weren't quite solid, retreating just beyond the edge of my vision. I forced myself to keep chanting, my voice cracking. My breath plumed in the air. The scraping intensified, joined now by a faint, distorted chorus of voices. They were indistinct, a jumble of overlapping echoes, a cacophony of lost moments. The chorale of echoes. It was reacting. It was here. A memory flashed, vivid and painful. My wife laughing, her head thrown back, sunlight catching her hair. It was so real, so immediate, I could almost smell her perfume. I staggered, clutching my skull. This was its weapon. My grief, my memories. It was trying to break me, to drown me in the very sorrow I sought to escape. But I wouldn't yield. I wouldn't. I reached for the knife. The book specified a cut, a symbolic offering. Not blood, not exactly, but a severing. I had to draw the line, break the connection. As my fingers closed around the hilt, the sounds around me crescendoed. The voices became clearer, individual words twisting into accusations, laments, promises. You are next. You belong. We wait. The very walls of the recreation hall seemed to ripple, the wooden planks blurring, shifting, as if the entire structure was breathing. The floor tilted, throwing me off balance. I pressed the blade against the table, trying to focus. My vision blurred. There was the lantern light dimming, or were my eyes failing me? The metallic scent was stronger now, mixed with something else, something sweet and sickly, like rotting flowers. I had to complete the ritual. I had to make the cut, but as I pressed down on the blade, the table beneath it began to vibrate violently, the wood groaning. The echoes intensified, focusing on a single, piercing wail that was undeniably her voice, filled with an agony I had never heard. It was a lie. It had to be. But the sound, the pain, it tore at something deep inside me. Could I truly sever what was already so deeply woven into the fabric of my own being? I didn't look back. Ahead, the path narrowed, eventually dissolving into a barely discernible trail winding deeper into the woods. This was it. The place my grandmother had alluded to in her fragmented journals, the place where the pact had been renewed, time and time again. My breath plumed in front of me, ghost-white. A mane larger than the others, loomed at the center of the clearing. It drew me in, a magnet to iron filings. The lantern light flickered, then dimmed, as if struggling against an unseen force. A low thrum began to vibrate in my teeth. A sound felt more than heard, like the deep hum of distant power lines, but wrong. It was a chorus of discordant echoes, each note a memory unspooling, twisting, then reforming into something monstrously new. The chorale. It was here. My heart began to drum a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I pushed open the heavy wooden door of the lodge. The air inside was thick, cloying, tasting of dust and ozone, and something else, something infinitely old, infinitely hungry. My lantern, now a weak ember, did little to pierce the gloom. I stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind me with a soft, final sigh. The thrum intensified, vibrating through the wooden floorboards, up my legs, into my skull. It felt like my very cells were being rearranged. It pulsed, an Inkai tide rising from the floor, swirling, expanding. It wasn't a physical thing, not truly. It was a tear in the fabric of what I knew, a rent in reality itself. My eyes strained, trying to make sense of the incomprehensible. They flickered, tantalizing, just out of reach, then dissolved into the swirling blackness. My voice was swallowed instantly. The thrum grew deafening, tearing at the edges of my sanity. My head swam. I felt light-headed, dizzy, as if gravity itself was abandoning me. My vision blurred, and the lodge around me seemed to warp, the walls breathing, the floor undulating. I had to fight it. My grandmother's words, scribbled in frantic ink, came back to me. A memory for a memory, a truth for a truth. The pact required a sacrifice, a piece of myself, given willingly to sever the ties. It wasn't about destroying the entity, I realized, but about containing it, about sealing the breach, at least for a time. What memory was strong enough? What could I give that would satisfy its endless hunger, yet leave me intact enough to fight another day? My wife, her face, her touch, the sound of her name. These were the anchors of my existence, the reason I fought, and they were exactly what it wanted. I would give it something else, something equally precious, equally vital. Not the happy ones, not the painful ones, but the ones that formed the bedrock of my identity. My name, my family history, the very concept of William, of who I was. It wasn't an act of defiance, but an offering. "Take it," I rasped, the words feeling alien on my tongue. "Take the burden, take the knowledge, take the lineage." A sudden, sharp intake of breath, though I had not drawn one. The thrum intensified to a screech, a sound that flayed my eardrums, then abruptly cut off. It slammed into me, not with physical impact, but with a mental one, a psychic blow that felt like a chisel chipping away at the very core of my being. I felt it peeling away, not my wife's face, not her laughter, but the context of those memories, the why I remembered them, the who that remembered them. My own name felt distant, a word belonging to someone else. The manor, the grandmother, the family pact, they became concepts without personal attachment, facts stripped of their emotional weight. It was like watching my own reflection shatter, the pieces still there, but no longer forming a coherent image of me. A profound emptiness bloomed in my chest, a space where something vital had been now scooped out clean. The large walls solidified, the floor settled. My breath came in ragged gasps. The silence was absolute, heavier than any sound. I looked around the empty lodge, at the dusty floorboards, the cobwebbed rafters. What had I done? And who was I now to have done it? The psychic impact wasn't a blow, not a shove, but a profound, internal crumbling. My mind, a fragile glass sculpture, vibrated on the edge of shattering. Every thought, every memory, every corner of myself felt stretched thin, translucent, about to snap. The screech which had been tearing at my ears didn't just stop. It folded inward, leaving behind a vacuum so absolute it felt like a physical absence, a black hole of sound. Then the darkness, that surging, consuming force, didn't recede. It simply settled, not around me, but in me. A chilling, all-encompassing quiet. I choked, or tried to. My throat was dry, raw, constricted. A metallic tang coated my tongue, a taste like old pennies left out in the rain. My knees buckled. I fell, but the ground wasn't there, or it was too far away. My body felt disconnected, a puppet whose strings had been cut mid-fall. When I finally hit something solid, it wasn't the splintered floorboards of the manor. The impact jarred my teeth, sent a dull ache through my hip, but the pain felt distant, an echo. My eyes fluttered open. Grey light filtered through a window, muted by a film of grime and something else, something white and feathery clinging to the pane. Snow. Outside, a vast, unbroken expanse of white stretched to a line of skeletal pines. The air that touched my face was frigid, biting, carrying the sharp, clean scent of frost and damp earth. This wasn't the manor. I pushed myself up, my limbs heavy, sluggish. My head spun, a slow, sickening rotation that made the sparse room tilt. Bare walls, stained a faded yellow. A rickety cot in one corner, stripped of its bedding. A single, naked bulb hanging from the ceiling, unlit. I stumbled to my feet, bracing myself against a wall that felt rough, splintered. How did I get here? I tried to pull at the edges to force a recollection, but it was like grasping at smoke. There was nothing. I was the caretaker. The words formed in my mind, not as a memory, but as a simple, undeniable fact. A caretaker for a closed summer camp, alone for winter. The role felt alien, yet strangely settled, as if it had always been mine. My clothes were different too, heavier, thicker, smelling faintly of wood smoke and damp wool, a practical uniform for a desolate existence. The camp was a ghost town. Each morning the same routine. I'd check the cabins, ensuring pipes hadn't burst, that no stray animals had found their way inside. The frozen lake, a sheet of dull silver, reflected the perpetually overcast sky. The only sound I ever heard was the wind, a long, mournful sigh through the pines, and the crunch of my own boots on the packed snow. Days blurred into a monotonous rhythm. I found a small radio, but it only crackled with static. The isolation was profound, a physical weight. Yet I felt calm, a terrifying, unnatural calm. Like a dream I couldn't quite recall, or a movie I had seen long ago. The sharp edges of agony had dulled, replaced by a strange, quiet acceptance. Sometimes when I stood by the lake, watching the wind ripple across the frozen surface, I felt a peculiar resonance. Not a sound, not a vibration, but a deep internal hum. It felt familiar, comforting even, as if I had finally found my true frequency. My face was thinner, etched with lines I didn't recognize. My eyes, though, they were the most striking. Not tired, not haunted, but still, too still. The pupils seemed to drink the light, deeper, wider than before, and there was a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer around the iris like oil on water. A fleeting, unsettling impression that the depths held more than just my own gaze. I touched the cold glass, my fingertips brushing against my own image. The man staring back was me, William, undoubtedly, but something had shifted, settled. It felt full of me, full of something asterisk else, an ancient, quiet awareness that had burrowed deep, taken root. It hadn't consumed me, not entirely. It had merely found a new stage, a new instrument, a new voice. The manor was gone from my mind, a forgotten nightmare. But the entity, had it truly left me, or had it merely changed its form? Had the final psychic impact been an expulsion or an integration? What new song would I learn to sing?